food, all of it runs through a waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. And right now, that waterway is effectively closed. The F-15 strikes every single morning, somewhere in America, a family sits down at the kitchen table, fills up the car with gas that costs more than it ever has, and wonders what in the world is going on. They hear the word Iran, they hear Strait of Hormuz, they hear F-15s deployed. And they get the feeling, that deep gut-level feeling, that something enormous is happening, something that the headlines are only giving them half of. And that feeling is correct. Because what is unfolding right now in that narrow ribbon of water between Iran and Oman is not just a military story. It is not just a geopolitical chess move. It is the story of how the entire architecture of the modern world, your gas prices, your grocery bill, the plastic in your phone, the fertilizer that grew your food, all of it runs through a waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. And right now, that waterway is effectively closed. The F-15 Strike Eagles that flew from their bases in the United Kingdom and landed in Jordan were not sent there for a routine rotation. They were sent there because the people making these decisions understand what's at stake. And if you want to understand what is actually happening, not the version with the flags and the victory declarations, but the real version, then you need to sit with this story from the very beginning, because the beginning tells you everything about where this ends. On January 16, 2026, the United States Air Force began repositioning a significant number of F-15E Strike Eagles from RAF Lakenheath in the United Kingdom into the Middle East, with many of them observed landing at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan. Now, when the military moves aircraft, there is always an official explanation, and the official explanation here was deterrence. The idea being that if you park enough firepower on Iran's doorstep, Iran will think twice, will recalculate, will step back from the edge. That is the theory of deterrence, and it is a theory that has worked in certain historical contexts. But what makes this moment different, what makes this particular deployment feel different from all the other deployments and buildups we've seen over the past decade, is the sheer scale of what followed. Since January 16, 2026, more than 80 C-17A Globemaster 3D cargo flights into Middle Eastern theaters were recorded, constituting the highest airlift tempo in recent months. Think about what that number actually means. These are not small aircraft. These are enormous military cargo planes, each one capable of carrying over 170,000 pounds of equipment, munitions, spare parts, maintenance crews, over 80 of them in a matter of weeks. That does not look like a deterrence posture. That looks like someone building something. That looks like someone who intends to be there for a while, someone who is embedding sustainment depth, as the analysts put it, into the theater. And when you combine that airlift surge with the naval movements that were happening simultaneously, you start to get a picture of something very deliberate, very pre-planned, and very serious. By mid-January 2026, the USS Abraham Lincoln was ordered to CENTCOM's area of operations and arrived on January 26th with its full strike group, including guided missile destroyers, cruisers, support vessels, and aircraft including FA-18E Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers, E-2 Hawkeyes, MH-60 helicopters, and F-35C Lightning IIs. And this was described at the time as the largest U.S. naval presence in the region since the crisis began in 2023. But even calling it the largest in years undersells it, because within weeks, the USS Gerald R. Ford would follow. Within weeks, you would have 2 carrier strike groups in the region simultaneously. You would have warships positioned in the Strait of Hormuz itself, in the Red Sea, in the Mediterranean. You would have littoral combat ships in the Persian Gulf equipped with mine countermeasure packages, specifically the kind of equipment you would need if someone started laying mines in a shipping lane. At Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, the number of F-15E Strike Eagles grew to at least 39 aircraft, with Patriot and THAAD missile defense systems also deployed to protect the growing fleet and support personnel. By early February, 3 separate F-15E squadrons had converged on Jordanian bases, one from RAF Lakenheath, one from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina, and one that had already been in the theater for nearly 10 months. And alongside them, F-16 Fighting Falcons, E-3 Sentry AWACS surveillance aircraft, F-22 air superiority jets, F-35 stealth fighters. The full spectrum of American air power, concentrated and ready in the eastern desert of Jordan. Now, you have to ask yourself something, because this is where the analytical exercise becomes critically important. When you look at a buildup of this size, when you look at 39 Strike Eagles, 2 carrier groups, 80-plus heavy cargo flights, Patriot batteries, THAAD systems, mine countermeasure ships, when you look at all of that assembled in one place at one time, you have to ask, was this deterrence or was this preparation? Because there is a meaningful difference between those two things. Deterrence is when you show someone a big stick and hope they walk away. Preparation is when you show someone a big stick because you have already decided to use it and you are positioning yourself to use it effectively. The events of late February 2026 tell you which one this actually was. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel initiated a series of joint military strikes on Iran, sparking what has since been called the 2026 Iran War. The strikes targeted military facilities, nuclear sites, and Iranian leadership, resulting in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And here is where the story pivots entirely, because everything up to this point, the F-15 deployments, the carrier groups, the cargo flights, all of that was the setup. The strikes of February 28th were the moment when the entire situation transformed from a crisis into a war. And the consequences that followed were not surprises. They were not unforeseen complications. They were the logical, predictable, inevitable results of the decision that was made. On March 2, 2026, a senior IRGC official confirmed that the Strait of Hormuz was closed. Iran launched retaliatory missile and drone attacks on U.S. military bases, Israeli territory, and Gulf states. The IRGC issued warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the strait, leading to an effective halt in shipping traffic. 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, that is all that separates the Persian Gulf from the wider world. And through that 21-mile gap, every single day, flows the energy that keeps the modern world running. Roughly 27% of the world's maritime trade in crude oil and petroleum products transits through the Strait of Hormuz. When Iran closed it, the global economy felt it almost immediately, not in the way you feel an earthquake, sudden, obvious, impossible to miss, more in the way you feel a fever, slowly, then all at once. Brent crude oil prices surpassed $100 per barrel on March 8, 2026, for the first time in 4 years, eventually rising to $126 per barrel at their peak. And these numbers, as dramatic as they are on a screen, do not fully capture what they mean in the real world. Because oil is not just oil. Oil is the substrate of the modern economy. It is in your gasoline, yes, but it is also in the plastic packaging your food comes in. It is in the fertilizer that grew your food in the first place. It is in the pharmaceuticals you take. It is in the asphalt you drive on. When oil prices spike, they spike across everything, in ways that take months to fully ripple through to your receipt at the grocery store or the pump. The head of the International Energy Agency described the situation caused by the war as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, larger than the Yom Kippur War of 1973, larger than the Iranian Revolution of 1979, larger than the Iraq-Iran War of 1980, larger than the Gulf War of 1990. Think about that for a moment. Every one of those events sent shockwaves through the global economy. Every one of them is remembered as a defining economic crisis of its era. And what is happening right now is being described by the people who study these things professionally as the biggest disruption of all of them. That is the context in which you need to understand what those F-15s were doing when they landed in Jordan. Following the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the oil production of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE collectively dropped by a reported 6.7 million barrels per day by March 10th and by at least 10 million barrels per day by March 12th. You have to sit with that number, 10 million barrels per day, gone. From markets that were already priced with a certain level of supply, a certain expectation that this oil would arrive, that it would be refined, that it would be distributed, that it would show up at the gas station or in the factory or in the power plant. 10 million barrels per day does not show up, and the global economy, which had no real plan for this, begins to shake. The maritime blockade triggered what analysts called a grocery supply emergency across Gulf Cooperation Council states, which rely on the strait for over 80% of their caloric intake. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted, forcing retailers to airlift staples and resulting in a 40 to 120% spike in consumer prices. This is the part of the story that almost never makes it into the framing around these military decisions, because when you watch an F-15 taxi down a runway in Jordan, when you see the imagery of carrier strike groups cutting through the Persian Gulf, the discourse tends to stay at a certain altitude. It talks about deterrence, about resolve, about signaling, about the power balance between Washington and Tehran. It very rarely descends to the level of a family in Kuwait or Qatar unable to find affordable bread on a grocery store shelf. But that family exists. That family is real. And the decisions made in Washington and Tel Aviv in late February 2026 created that family's reality. The US and its IEA partners coordinated the largest release of oil reserves in history, 400 million barrels over 120 days. But that equaled just over 3 million barrels per day, far short of the disruption at Hormuz. And here is where you begin to see the limits of American power in the clearest possible terms. Not the limits of American military power. The F-15s and the carrier groups represent genuinely extraordinary capability, but the limits of what military power can actually solve, because you can put every Strike Eagle you have in Jordan, you can put 2 carrier groups in the Gulf, you can launch the largest air campaign since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and you can still find yourself, weeks later, watching the Strait of Hormuz remain effectively closed, watching oil prices surge past $100 a barrel, watching global food security analysts use the phrase humanitarian crisis, and watching your policy options narrow to 2, make difficult concessions to Tehran, or escalate further and risk losing naval vessels. US government officials and Wall Street analysts began considering the prospect that oil prices could surge to $200 a barrel. At $270 a barrel, analysts projected that the impact on inflation and economic growth would roughly double, creating a stagflationary shock that could shift everything from the path of central banks to the outcome of midterm elections. The word stagflation is one of those economics terms that sounds technical and dry until you understand what it means in practice. It means inflation goes up, prices rise, and economic growth goes down at the same time. That is the worst combination possible for a working family, because in a normal recession, prices tend to fall, which softens the blow. In normal inflation, the economy is usually growing, which means more jobs and higher wages to offset some of the pain. Stagflation gives you the worst of both: prices going up, wages going stagnant, growth slowing, and no easy tool for policymakers to fix any of it. That is what analysts were warning about. That is the trajectory that a prolonged Hormuz closure was putting the world on. The UN World Food Programme warned that the war was driving significant long-term increases in global food prices. The Fertilizer Institute stated that nearly 50% of global urea and sulfur exports, as well as 20% of global liquefied natural gas, a key feedstock for nitrogen fertilizers, transit through the Strait of Hormuz. This is where the hidden machinery of globalization becomes visible in the most uncomfortable way. Fertilizer is the invisible link between what happens in the Persian Gulf and what ends up on your dinner table. Because fertilizer, the nitrogen-rich compounds that American farmers pour into their fields every spring, does not come from nowhere. Much of the raw material for it transits through the Strait of Hormuz. When that strait closes, fertilizer prices spike. When fertilizer prices spike, farmers plant less or spend more. When farmers spend more, food prices rise. The spring planting season of 2026 was approaching. The people who study agricultural supply chains were raising alarms, quietly but clearly, that the disruption at Hormuz would be felt not just in March and April, but potentially in the harvests of 2026 and even 2027. Iranian drone strikes on Gulf neighbors also targeted commercial data centers, damaging 2 Amazon facilities in the United Arab Emirates and 1 in Bahrain. This detail, often buried in the military reporting, deserves far more attention than it receives. Because Amazon is not just a shopping website, Amazon Web Services is the cloud infrastructure underpinning enormous portions of the global digital economy. Banks run on it, healthcare systems run on it, government agencies run on it. When Iranian drones took out those data centers, it was not just a military escalation. It was a demonstration that in the 21st century, warfare extends into the digital infrastructure of the global economy, and that even the most sophisticated deterrence postures, built around aircraft and carrier groups, offer limited protection against that dimension of conflict. Analysts noted that Iran, over the previous 6 months, had quietly taken additional steps to move critical assets further underground, while also constructing a multi-layered defense centered on mines, missiles, submarines, and drones designed to slow down US forces. This is crucial to understanding the strategic picture. Iran had been preparing for this. Not preparing in the sense of expecting to win a conventional war against the United States, because no serious analyst in Tehran believes that, but preparing in the sense of making the cost of a conflict high enough, painful enough, prolonged enough, that the other side has to reconsider. It is the logic of asymmetric deterrence. You cannot beat the American military in a symmetric fight, but you can make a symmetric fight irrelevant by turning the Strait of Hormuz into a liability for the entire global economy, by making the cost of the conflict fall not just on American soldiers, but on everyone who fills a gas tank or buys food or runs a business anywhere on Earth. For energy-dependent Asian economies, including Japan, South Korea, India, and China, whose oil lifelines traverse the Strait of Hormuz, the reinforcement of U.S. air power reverberated beyond the Levant, embedding Middle Eastern instability directly into Indo-Pacific economic security and maritime chokepoint vulnerability assessments. And this is where the geopolitical dimension of this conflict opens up into something much larger than a US-Iran confrontation. Because China, India, Japan, and South Korea together account for 75% of oil and 59% of LNG exports that transit the Strait of Hormuz. These are not peripheral players. These are the largest economies in Asia, representing billions of people and trillions of dollars in economic activity. Every day that the strait remains closed is a day that China, already navigating an economic slowdown, already managing the pressure of American tariffs, absorbs an additional energy cost. Every day is a day that India, whose economy runs heavily on imported oil, faces inflationary pressure it cannot absorb easily. Every day is a day that Japan, which has essentially no domestic energy resources and imports almost everything it burns, grows more economically fragile. The Hormuz crisis is not a regional story, it is a global story wearing a regional costume. In early February, 6 IRGC Navy gunboats attempted to stop and seize a U.S. tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. The vessel ignored their demands and continued toward the Arabian Sea under the escort of the USS McFall. A U.S. F-35 fighter jet shot down an Iranian Shahid drone approaching the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln. These incidents, each one of them, represented a moment where the situation could have escalated instantaneously into something even larger. An Iranian gunboat that does not stop, a drone that comes closer than expected, a nervous trigger finger on either side. Any one of those moments could have changed the trajectory of events in ways that no one could have fully controlled. This is the reality of military crises that the deterrence theorists tend to underweight. The logic of deterrence assumes rational actors making calculated decisions at every step. But military crises at this level of intensity involve exhausted people, incomplete information, the fog of war, and the ever-present possibility of miscalculation. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas quantified that a closure of the Strait of Hormuz, removing close to 20% of global oil supplies from the market during the second quarter of 2026, was expected to raise the average West Texas Intermediate oil price to $98 per barrel and lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points. That figure, 2.9 percentage points of global GDP growth, is worth dwelling on. Global GDP growth in a healthy year runs between 3 and 4%. A reduction of 2.9 percentage points does not mean a minor slowdown. It means the global economy effectively stalls. It means millions of jobs that would have been created do not exist. It means billions of dollars in investment that would have happened does not happen. It means governments that were managing their debt loads suddenly find themselves in deficit. And all of this traces back directly, mechanically, not metaphorically, to the decision to deploy those F-15s, to the decision to launch Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, to the decision to kill Iran's supreme leader and attempt through military force to solve a problem that decades of sanctions, negotiations, and pressure had not solved. Analysts noted that a sustained Hormuz disruption would raise fuel and freight costs, worsen inflation expectations, tighten financial conditions, and weigh most heavily on import-dependent emerging markets. In Asia and parts of Africa, that would mean weaker trade balances, greater currency pressure, and less room for central banks to support growth. When you look at who gets hurt the worst by what happens in the Strait of Hormuz, it is not the United States first. The United States is the world's largest oil producer. It has domestic supply that insulates it, at least partially, from the immediate shock. The people who get hurt the most, first and most severely, are the people who had the least say in any of this. The families in the Philippines, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Nigeria, in Vietnam. Countries that face severe fuel shortages and whose governments declared emergencies in the wake of the strait's closure. These are people who never voted on American foreign policy, never shaped the military doctrine, never sat in the rooms where these decisions were made. And yet the consequences of those decisions arrive at their doorsteps first and hardest. Freight intelligence analysts noted that the backup at the Strait of Hormuz was already causing congestion at ports worldwide, and warned that if the conflict lasted a month, goods would be delayed and the price tags on those goods would rise. The ports of Los Angeles, of Rotterdam, of Singapore, all of them affected. Supply chains that took years to build and were already fragile from the COVID disruptions and the Red Sea Houthi attacks of 2024 and 2025, now absorbing another massive shock. And the Red Sea, which had been expected to reopen in 2026 and provide some relief to global shipping, now certain to remain closed throughout the year given the broader regional conflict. The interconnection is total. There is no part of the global trading system that does not touch, at some point, the Middle East. What the F-15 deployment in January represented, looked at honestly and without the filter of triumphalism, was a bet. A very large, very expensive, very consequential bet. The bet was that American military superiority could be translated directly into political outcomes. That enough air power, enough carrier groups, enough firepower could force Tehran to capitulate, to abandon its nuclear program, to accept terms that the Iranian government had consistently and categorically rejected through decades of negotiation. That bet produced strikes. The strikes produced retaliation. The retaliation produced a Hormuz closure. The closure produced the largest energy disruption in recorded history. And the world is still living with the results, still counting the costs, still watching oil prices, still watching the Strait, still wondering when and how and at what price this ends. That is the real story of the F-15s over Hormuz. Not the hardware, not the sortie counts, not the precision strike capability. The real story is what happens when military instruments are applied to political problems in a world where everything is connected to everything else, and the second and third and fourth order consequences do not respect the borders of the conflict or the interests of those who started it. Every single morning, somewhere in America, a family sits down at the kitchen table, fills up the car with gas that costs more than it ever has, and wonders what in the world is going on. They hear the word Iran, they hear Strait of Hormuz, they hear F-15s deployed. And they get the feeling, that deep gut-level feeling, that something enormous is happening, something that the headlines are only giving them half of. And that feeling is correct, because what is unfolding right now in that narrow ribbon of water between Iran and Oman is not just a military story. It is not just a geopolitical chess move. It is the story of how the entire architecture of the modern world, your gas prices, your grocery bill, the plastic in your phone, the fertilizer that grew your food, all of it runs through a waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. And right now, that waterway is effectively closed. The F-15 Strike Eagles that flew from their bases in the United Kingdom and landed in Jordan were not sent there for a routine rotation. They were sent there because the people making these decisions understand what's at stake. And if you want to understand what is actually happening, not the version with the flags and the victory declarations, but the real version, then you need to sit with this story from the very beginning, because the beginning tells you everything about where this ends. On January 16, 2026, the United States Air Force began repositioning a significant number of F-15E Strike Eagles from RAF Lakenheath in the United Kingdom into the Middle East, with many of them observed landing at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan. Now, when the military moves aircraft, there is always an official explanation, and the official explanation here was deterrence. The idea being that if you park enough firepower on Iran's doorstep, Iran will think twice, will recalculate, will step back from the edge. That is the theory of deterrence, and it is a theory that has worked in certain historical contexts. But what makes this moment different, what makes this particular deployment feel different from all the other deployments and buildups we've seen over the past decade, is the sheer scale of what followed. Since January